Hi, welcome to One Eye on the Page. This is Scott. This is 5-Year Battle Stephen King. We are down to the final 8 now, or technically the final 7, because last week The Stand defeated the Dark Tower 7. I'm going to be quite honest that I'm pretty sure I know who's going to win each of the contests in the final 8. Quarterfinals, 4 books against 4 books, obviously I talked a good game, but The Stand was always going to beat the Dark Tower 7. I know who's going to win next week's competition, and I know who's going to win the week after that. I know 3 of the books that are going to be in the final 4 without having done 3 of these videos yet, including the current one I'm doing. But the current one I'm doing, I don't know who's going to win. I'm stalling a little bit because I'm trying to figure out in my own head. This probably isn't a wise way to go about making the videos. I should know beforehand which one's going to win. But that's not the way I want to do things. We have Different Seasons, collection of 4 novellas, which I also have an Italian, by the way. I have not read it in Italian. I read The Eyes of the Dragon in Italian while I was also reading it in English. My Italian has subsided drastically since I was doing Duolingo for it in preparation to visiting Italy. So we have Different Seasons versus On Writing. King's best novella collection, King's best nonfiction book, which, to be fair, there are far fewer nonfiction books to pick from. There's Danse Macabre, there's Nightmares in the Sky, which isn't really a Stephen King book, and there's a Secret Window. I don't believe there's another one. This is the best of those, but it is also one of King's best books. It is in the final 10 books that I picked, but if I were ranking all the books in order, which I will probably do after I finish these videos, I think this would still be in the top 10. Would it be number 1? Maybe, maybe not. The fact that I'm even considering it being number 1 says something, because putting a nonfiction book over a fiction book that's a lot for me. I automatically tend to downgrade the nonfiction when I'm comparing it to fiction because I prefer fiction. We got these two. Who's going to win? Let's start with Different Seasons. Now, chances are, even if you're not a fan of Stephen King, that you know Different Seasons, or you know something in Different Seasons, which, I mean, you could tell just by right here, Stand By Me, one of the most popular movies from the 80s, or one of the most popular movies from the 90s, and a movie that many people consider one of the best movies ever, or at least if you watch TBS, Shawshank Redemption, which is based on Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, and the Stand By Me was based on The Body. There's also a decent movie, although I don't think it's necessarily a great movie. It definitely doesn't compare to Shawshank Redemption or Stand By Me, but Apt Pupil, which stars, I believe, Ian McKellen, and I can't remember the boy's name who was Brad Renfro, I believe, who has unfortunately passed since, and also has David Schwimmer in it. I'll be quite honest, and I've said this before when I was talking about different seasons. Apt Pupil is a great story. It's just not one that I particularly care for. We will go over each of these right now. Obviously, if you've seen The Shawshank Redemption, it's a fairly faithful adaptation. The big difference is that Red in the novella is actually an Irishman, and Morgan Freeman is likely not. I don't know his background, but I feel fairly safe to say that he is not. But other than that, a fairly faithful adaptation. So even if you haven't read the novella, you got a pretty good 1-to-1 ratio. I think, as with most King works, that the story is better than the movie. And I think, again, it's an excellent movie. But I think that the novella gets more into the character of Red as much as of Andy. And also, I think that the movie plays it a little bit safe. It doesn't really talk to you about like the crimes that Red committed or kind of the crime. Whereas the book, it does. It doesn't paint them as innocent men, except possibly Andy. There is a small contingent of people who actually believe Andy is guilty of killing his wife, but in her lover, but I'm not among them. But the other prisoners, it doesn't whitewash their crimes. It does. I think in the movie it kind of has to do that to get you on side, whereas the novella has a little bit more room to move. That it's some of King's best writing. King has a way of kind of character monologuing, kind of like with a nostalgic twist or a. I kind of think of him as Ray Bradbury, not Fahrenheit 451 Ray Bradbury, but like Something Wicked This Way Comes. Ray Bradbury, or some of his short stories. You just have the nostalgia and the sometimes purple language, perhaps a little bit too sickly sweet. I think King approaches that both here in Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption and in The Body. The ending couple of chapters of it also. It's a movie that's playing in your head with narration, but it's not that annoying narration that is telling you stuff that they weren't able to get in the movie. It's like, I don't know, a Stranger Things Wonder Years combo, and it when King does it well, it works amazingly well. Yeah, and I'm thinking particularly of like when Red's going to find Andy at the end of the novella, or Peter Stevens, that touch upon it. And if you've only seen the movie, I think you owe it to yourself to read the novella. Again, I think the novella is better, and I think the movie's amazing. As you probably have seen the movie, I don't feel like I have to go too deep into what the story is. A man most likely falsely convicted of his wife's murder and the murder of her lover spends many years trying to escape. It's a simple plot, but I mean, it's also about the human condition and about hope. And I'm kind of right there with Red, just imagining what it's got to be like for Andy slowly digging his way out for years. And King really brings you into that. At Pupil, like I said, it is not my favorite. It I've talked before about there there can be a difference between best and favorite. I don't think At Pupil is the best novella, but it is a great novella. It is nowhere near my favorite, but it is about a young man who finds someone who turns out that they are a Nazi. And rather than turn them in, uh, Todd, the young man, wants to learn about what the Nazi knows. And they grow closer together, also somewhat antagonistic toward each other, and they start to develop some of the same habits, and they're not good habits. I'll leave it at that. If Richard Bachman had ever written a novella, this would probably be what the novella was, although probably would have ended up a little bit darker, which is a bit amazing for me to say. I do think it's a great novella, but I can't even say it's the best written novella in the book. I personally, for me, out of the four novellas in this book, it's the worst, both as it is written and as how I perceive it. That's just my opinion. I know generally people will feel that the novella that is my favorite would be the worst, and that's how life is. So the third novella is The Body, which Stand By Me was based on. It is the movie is not as faithful as Shawshank Redemption was. Uh, there are people who die in The Body who don't die in Stand By Me. There is in the movie included The Revenge of Lardass Hogan, which was in the novella also, but there is also another short story in The Body that's not included in Stand By Me, and that was a good call on the movie maker's part. That's probably the worst part of The Body is this short story that Gordy LaChance wrote, and he calls it out himself, and for good reason. I don't. I know King wanted to present it as part of what Gordy was going through at the time, but it's just not a great short story, and it really derails. Hey, train track. The novella for a bit. It obviously gets back on track, but yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I feel a little bit more comfortable saying that that's not my favorite novella because that's not a good short story. But the overall novella is amazing. I have sections of this novella that I will read separately from actually reading a novella. I do that sometimes where there's a piece of writing that I love so much that I would just go back and read that and not actually read everything that's from my, like when the boys first discover the body of Ray Brower, I believe. Gordy has a little thing about how the death hits him that I really love reading, and of course, some of his talking about Chris Chambers. Also, this is probably King's sweetest novella. I can't think of any other one that would take that point, but I think if I were ranking the novellas, this one would probably come. This one and Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption kind of do a little bit back and forth. Which one's number two? Number four is obviously At Pupil. I think these two go back and forth. Which one is number two and which one is number three? Which means, of course, that the breathing method is number one for me. It's for me. I know it's probably only for me. I get that. I understand that. I have accepted that. I'm the only one who looks at this as the number one novella, not only of this collection, but probably all of Stephen King novellas. I don't know if I would say all of Stephen King novellas, but it's definitely up there. I mentioned before it's set in a club, which unfortunately only appears in two stories. This one and The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands, which is a bit of a disappointment. Not so much as a story. As a story, it's okay. It's good. It's decent. But with it being part of the club, I was disappointed. And then, of course, those are the only two stories that the club appears in. The narrator is one of King's everyman characters, which he always does very well. Kind of like, since I like to mention him pretty much every time, Ralph Roberts in Insomnia. Although the narrator, who I'm not sure, I think we may get his name at one point, but I can't recall what it is. He's a little bit more timid than Ralph. But it is about this club, and like every Christmas Eve, they tell stories, which they believe, or the narrator believes, to be true stories. And generally, they're not really Christmas stories necessarily. They're a bit of a morbid turn to them. One year, I believe I'm probably getting the man's name incorrect. I believe it's Edward McCarran. Pretty sure the last name definitely is McCarran. But he used to be a doctor, and he tells of a woman who came to him. She was pregnant. She was unmarried. Basically, the story is about their relationship, pretty much purely as doctor and patient. Well, he obviously seems to admire her. There's nothing untoward going on between the two of them. But the relationship between the two of them, and then when she delivers. And please recall that I said that these stories have a bit of a morbid turn, but it's also heartwarming and a good Christmas story. Not one you would find on Hallmark or Lifetime, obviously, um, but it would be one I would be okay adding to the Christmas rotation. I'll be quite honest, and I have a guest room that's all decked out in Christmas right now, and it's June. So you have that novella. Plus, there's also a very entertaining afterword by Stephen King. His author's notes usually are very entertaining. And then we have On Writing. This started out as a book about writing. That was pretty much it. Then Stephen King's accident happened. He was hit by a van driven by a man named Brian Smith. He ended up in the hospital for a long time. Had many bones broken. Believed that he could have died. Had a painkiller addiction, and he's already somebody who had an addiction problem. So he went back to finish this. So it's almost three, almost four different things. One, it is a book about writing. Basically, he talks about it being a toolbox that you could use to write. I mean, if you have this and you have Strunk and White, which he references in this, you have a starting point. But as he also mentions here, you got to have talent. Um, so you have a starting point for writing, and he goes into that, and it's very simple, clear rules that anybody can use. It's not going to make you a great writer, but it's going to improve you as a writer. He also kind of does a memoir thing. He mentions Mary Carr's The Liars Club, which I've read, and it's not like that. As he says, he does kind of like I do sometimes. I can't remember why I walked into a room after I do so. So I don't have like full recall of things that happened long in the past, and apparently neither does he. So he just has flashes that he kind of talks about, his past. And if you want to know more about his biography, there are books out there about it. But one thing that he does talk about is his drug addiction and kind of how harrowing it is for him and his family. And you kind of get the feeling, or I kind of get the feeling at least, that if Tabitha King wasn't around, Stephen King could very well have died. And we all had that to thank her for. And also, she is a great writer in her own right as well. I always mention when I talk about romance novels that One on One by Tabitha King is one of my favorite romance novels. It's about teenagers, but if you are looking for a romance that's kind of a little bit outside of what you're used to, check it out. And also, he talks about the accident in great detail. I mean, after reading him saying he doesn't have great recall as like someone as Mary Carr, and then the detail he gives into this accident is just amazing. Um, and it's probably one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. Um, there are better memoirs. If I just looked at it as a memoir, it's not great, but it's everything that it is all combined that lifts it up. I've definitely read better memoirs. I've read good writing books. I've read good books that detailed drug addiction, but it's just the way he combines everything together. This is a book that almost anybody can get something out of. If you've ever been a drug addict or known a drug addict, or tried writing at all, or if you even just want to be able to write a little bit better, it doesn't even have to be about writing fiction. It's just about writing. Um, it's just I am stalling because I still don't know which one I'm gonna pick. This is oh boy, this is this is hard. It's hard. I almost want to get a coin and flip it, but that wouldn't be fair. I think that I could come to you tomorrow and re record this and have a different answer. But in this moment, right now, by the slimmest of margins, and only because, as I said, I tend to rate fiction higher than nonfiction. I think I have to give it to different seasons. I could give you a different answer tomorrow, but this is single elimination, and you may have lost on a technicality on writing, but you lost. It's got to be different seasons. It's just four great novellas, even though Apt Pupil's not one of my favorites, against a nonfiction book. Now, as somebody who writes, should be writing more, should actually get off my ass and work on outlines that I've been meaning to. And I don't even want to get you started on here because you don't give a crap about this. I'm supposed to be talking about Stephen King books. So anyway, I'm kind of also just something that I don't generally do when talking about the Stephen King books is I'm kind of thinking of you, person on the other side of this. The fact that it's fiction versus nonfiction also they're so close that I'm kind of going like I'm stepping outside myself a little bit. I'm thinking more people would consider different seasons the better book. I'm not going to do that with the other books. And I know that that may get me in trouble because I've already got a few comments. Some of you are not Insomnia fans. I am. So people are possibly not going to like me, but maybe they will. Or maybe they won't like me, but it will have nothing to do with my book choices. Different seasons beats on writing. And next week we have two long boys, 11/22/63 and It. You may think you know what's going to win. You may be right. But I'm going to take you on a journey anyway. So please like and subscribe, and I will see you next week when we'll get to the inevitable or a huge shock that's going to piss people off. Talk to you then.